All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Andrea Lowen, and I'm in Calgary, Alberta. On behalf of CMDA Canada, I would like to welcome you all, and in particular, welcome Dr. Farr Curlin from Raleigh, North Carolina, Duke University, who's joined us this evening to present on a topic that he's written extensively about, and we're really fortunate to have him to come and speak to us today. Dr. Curlin is going to be speaking about the way of medicine for Christians. Dr. Curlin is a hospice and palliative care physician. He joined Duke University in January of 2014. He holds joint appointments in the School of Medicine and the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine, as well as in the Duke Divinity School with its initiative on theology, medicine, and culture. Dr. Curlin, after graduating medical school, did internal medicine residency at the University of Chicago. He has done empirical research on uh, the influence of moral traditions and commitments, both religious and secular, on physicians' clinical practice, and is published in the New England Journal of Medicine as well. He continues to explore the areas of medicine, medical ethics, the doctor-patient relationship, and the role of religion and in the practice of medicine. So, with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Curlin, and thank you so much for coming to share your expertise with us today. We will be taking questions after the initial presentation, so we will definitely have lots of time for discussion as well. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Andrea. And thank you all for joining this conversation. Can everyone see this slide? Does it look right? It's our way of medicine for Christians? Okay. Well, I would first be remiss if I didn't greet you from the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative at Duke, where I am co-director, but work with a number of colleagues in what I think is a pretty remarkable little initiative, this initiative on theology, medicine, and culture. We basically have created an opportunity for those who have vocations to healthcare and want in-depth Christian theological formation with an eye toward engaging the work of healthcare with wisdom and clarity and joy and faithfulness and integrity as Christians to come and study with us. We have a track. We have a residential program that's primarily for trainees who come to us either before entering medical school or during medical training. And then we have now a track also, or a program also, that's for practicing clinicians that can be done with just a week on campus in August and a week on campus in January. So if you're interested in those, check them out, Theology and Medicine at Duke. I want us to think about, is there a way of medicine for Christians? And if so, what is that way? We have these fellows who come to study with us, and many of them are asking the question of calling. What is my calling? And they come to us because they have entered into medicine, or they think they want to enter medicine because they sense that it is a calling, or at least as part of their calling as Christians. And then they go on, those who are in medical school, and they find after some experience that it's not obvious how they'll go on in a way that answers to that calling, the calling to love God and love one's neighbor, to follow Jesus within their work in American, in our case, or in most of our students' case, or we should say North American healthcare. Sometimes they express this ambivalence or ambiguity in the language of the personal versus the professional. So they're asking, how do I continue to participate in the medical profession to which I thought I was called while protecting my personal integrity as a Christian? Or they might ask, how do I balance my personal and professional identities? It seems to me that the phenomenon of burnout is in part a symptom of losing touch with how medicine fits into one's calling. We see this among many of our hybrid students, people who are mid-career clinicians who are just struggling to make sense of how it really is a part of their calling to keep going through what they're going through day after day. We even see it among medical students, though. And the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative is about turning to the resources of our story as Christians, the story of everything with Christ at the center, to understand what medicine is and what it's for and how it fits into the lives of Christians. And, is there a way of medicine and for Christians is a question we can't answer unless we can answer the question, what is medicine? There are two broad understandings of what medicine is that are operative in today's medical practices and in the practices of most medical practitioners. And these two different understandings give contrasting answers regarding many parts of the practice of medicine. So, in one sense, the question, what is medicine, seems simple and straightforward. Surely, medicine is the practice of healing fellow human beings, of preserving and restoring the health of those who suffer injury or illness. Surely good medicine is motivated by concern for the patient's health. It's guided by the medical practitioner's expertise in the ways of the human body. And health seems equally obviously an important and even essential aspect of human flourishing. So if you are sick, anyone on this call, or one of your loved ones, and you're suffering from a health-related impairment, you're just not as well off as you could be if your health were restored. There's an aspect of your flourishing as a human being that is impaired just insofar as you are not healthy. And this account of medicine makes sense, it seems to me, of what medical practitioners are doing when they are most obviously doing, or where they're most obviously practicing medicine. And it's what makes them medical practitioners rather than practitioners of some other art. And this account of medicine can give rise to important norms of medical morality, ethical norms to guide medical practitioners, such as do not act contrary to a patient's health, do not let your concerns for your patient's health be subverted by prejudice, apathy, or self-interest. Give to your professional practice the attention, time, and energy needed to shape your life as a person devoted to excellence in preserving and restoring health. With my colleague, Chris Tollefson, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina, I've argued that this conception of medicine and its morality, which we call Chris and I, the way of medicine, should guide medical practice. That medical professionals, when they're acting reasonably, will act in accordance with the norms of the way of medicine. So understood. For that will be necessary for their medical practice to be truly congruent with human flourishing. So that's one vision of what medicine is. But this vision of medicine finds competition in an approach that we call the provider of services model. This model, which has steadily grown in influence over the past half century, assumes that medicine comprises a set of technical skills that professionals are to use primarily in service of a patient's autonomously chosen preferences and goals, even if those preferences and goals detach from or even directly contradict the patient's health. So the norms of the provider of services model are different than those of the way of medicine. In the provider of services model, an intervention is medically indicated and may be an obligation of the practitioner as long as that intervention is legal, as long as it effectively brings about the patient's goal, and it's freely chosen by the patient. So a practitioner of the way of medicine might object, for example, to physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia, as is obviously the more common practice in Canada, might object to these as acts that contradict medicine's fundamental commitment to patient health. But proponents of the provider of services model increasingly will argue that where these practices are legal and feasible, physicians should provide them or refer for them at least. And if they're unwilling to do so, they should exit the profession. I'll give you a more mundane example. I recently heard a talk about innovations in hospice care to allow patients on dialysis, this is in the US, of course, but to allow patients on dialysis to receive some dialysis while still in hospice, which is not characteristically done because of the cost of dialysis. It seems to me this is probably a good idea. But it was interesting that the story that was advanced in this talk to make sense of why this is a good idea is that it is all about being patient-centered, which was interpreted as facilitating patient choice, patients' options, helping patients be in control, live and die on their own terms. It wasn't motivated by a sense that, hey, there's some feature of health, some aspect of health that it's good to preserve, namely the health that's preserved by, cleaning the blood of the things that the kidneys are normally clean. We should do that when we can, but no, we should just, it's all about giving people choice. And increasingly, the expectation that physicians will provide the services patients request is framed as a matter of patients' rights, that the patient has a right to such services and the physician has a corollary obligation to provide them. I think I just went backwards. Of course, I was going to say, few physicians practice in ways that fit fully into either of these two models of medicine. No one operating within the provider services model thinks that health is unimportant. At least I've not met another practitioner who thinks health is not important to medical practitioners. And many dedicated physicians provide occasional services whose connection to health seems kind of remote, like prescribing birth control pills to someone who doesn't need them for some health reason per se. Nevertheless, the two models of medicine provide a helpful way to understand a number of conflicts in contemporary medicine, such as those between defenders and opponents of conscientious objection in medicine. When a patient requests or demands something that a physician finds morally problematic, this is often framed as a matter of the physician's personal and private conscience intruding upon his or her public and professional practice. Refusing such requests seems to many to violate professional boundaries. It seems that personal convictions are fine so long as one recognizes that personal convictions have to be set aside when you're taking up your professional role. But from the standpoint of the way of medicine, these refusals by physicians look quite different. They look like physicians refusing to act contrary to their commitments as physicians. They are basically fulfilling, it seems, in refusing, they're choosing to fulfill the profession they have made to their patients, their colleagues, and the public. Which is to say that in almost every case, conscientious refusals by physicians are refusals based on the physician's judgment that the intervention requested either is not required by or even directly contradicts the patient's health or some other important medical moral norm. And we see this with refusals that don't appear controversial. So when a clinician, for example, refuses to prescribe antibiotics to a patient who appears to have a common cold, or a clinician refuses to prescribe opioids out of a concern to avoid the adverse side effects of opioids. These are cases not where the personal trumps the professional, but they're cases in which the physician is personally fulfilling his or her profession. And we also see this with more controversial interventions, with elective abortion, for example. If a young woman or a woman who's pregnant seeks referral for an abortion, and a doctor cannot in good conscience make that referral, it can seem on the face of it that that's just a case of them trying to protect some personal value or impose some personal value. But when you talk to any such physician, what you find is that physician does not believe that abortion, elective abortion, let's say in this case, or even referring for an abortion is something that is required by the patient's health. In fact, they think it's contradictory to the patient's health and it's contradictory to their profession. You see that with medicalized gender affirmation or transition, with any number of hot topics where doctors conscientiously refuse, some doctors, to do what some patients genuinely want. Understanding disagreements within medicine as potential conflicts between the way of medicine and the provider of services model doesn't settle the disagreements, but I think it does help us understand the disagreements and what's at stake in them. And there's a lot more to say about the way of medicine. Happy to talk about it more in our Q&A time, which we'll get to here in about 15 minutes. But I want to turn now to the question, is there a way of medicine for Christians? Specifically for Christians? And if so, what is that way? And I propose to you that the way of medicine for Christians begins with what we call the way of medicine. Alan Verhey, who a late theologian who was a mentor to me and to some of my colleagues, in an essay on the Hippocratic Oath, insofar as a Christian may swear it, which is a version of the oath that grew up and began to be used. We're not sure exactly when, but potentially as early as the 4th century, but certainly by the medieval period. He wrote an essay about this, and in that he says, the first lesson of the oath, insofar as a Christian may swear it, was that Christian ethics does not disown natural morality. The Christian story does not force those who own it to disown either medicine as a practice or human rationality. The way of medicine in its basic structure has been embraced over history by Jews, by pagan Greeks, at least those within the Hippocratic Reform movement, and by and some Romans who adopted that same tradition, certainly by Christians, by Muslims, and by many others. It is the vision of medicine that is implicit in codes of ethics like the World Medical Association's Declaration of Geneva, and arguably the 1848 Code of Medical Ethics with the AMA. And I'm not familiar with the CMA's initial codes of medical ethics, but I suspect they express basically the way of medicine's basic moral structure. And this is what makes sense of what nurses and physicians and other medical practitioners are doing in hospitals near you when they are most obviously practicing medicine. So if I ask you just to think of a physician practicing medicine, I dare say that the image that'll come first to mind is going to be someone taking care of, in an obvious way, someone who is obviously sick or injured. And what they're doing is seeking to preserve and restore that person's health. So I propose that the first step for Christians is to embrace the moral commitments of and respect the limits of the way of medicine, which central to which is act only insofar as your actions are consistent with a commitment to the patient's health. But for Christians, the way of medicine is markedly enriched. So Alan Verhey again writes, the second lesson of the oath, insofar as a Christian may swear it, is that Christians concerned with medical ethics should have the integrity to set medicine in the context of the Christian story, to form, inform, and reform medicine. The first lesson stands against any premature sectarian stance, against opting prematurely for either a sectarian community or a sectarian medicine. The second lesson stands against any simple identification of a Christian ethic, either with universal and rational principles or with a professional ethic, against, for example, sanctifying contract by identifying it with covenant. The task is to transform, or to put less presumptuously, to qualify a rational ethic and a professional ethic by candid attention to the Christian story. So in my terms, I think restating what Verhey's talking about here, Christians didn't come into the world and say, hey, we have our own science of medicine. We have our own totally unique, totally distinct practice of medicine. No, rather, and if you look back to the writings of the church fathers, they write about health and illness, you see this. They respected what they called secular medicine, which is what we would call scientific medicine, and saw it as a gift of God, like they saw the science, Basil called it similar to the science of agriculture, and that it corresponds to a particular need we have. And so they treated it as if it had its own kind of integrity. Christians were allowed to see Jewish physicians or Muslim physicians or other physicians so long as they respected the basic integrity of the practice. But Christians also had really rich ways of thinking about suffering and illness and disability and living in the face of our own mortality and patience in the face of suffering and how we deal with pain and what we owe to our neighbors and what hospitality toward the sick and broken down looks like. They really surprised the ancient world with their practices of hospitality, particularly to the sick and the diminished and the disabled. So they did take the practice of medicine and set it, as Verhey puts here, in the context of a Christian vision of the human person and the Christian vision of the world and our place within it. So Christians don't displace professional medical morality with personal Christian values, but by discerning the character of our world, including what it means to be human, and by embracing and developing the practices of medicine into what they can be if they are to fit that world and become more fully what they are meant to be. Here's some examples. I think Christianity gives us, again, you don't have to be a Christian to be a good medical practitioner, but Christianity, I think, gives us a better account of why we care for the sick. It's kind of strange, honestly, within a strictly naturalistic framework to care for people who are long past reproduction, which everybody recognizes is good to do. Christianity gives us this tradition of recognizing the imago Dei, or the image of God in every human being, which was a shocking thing in the ancient world. There'd never been before a culture that had acted as if every human being has a fundamental dignity that gives them a fundamental equality with other human beings. Not sameness, but a fundamental equality. We have a tradition in which weakness is not despised. And we have all this scripture talking about how God is close to those who are brokenhearted, those who are broken down, to the poor, that it's that the weak in God's economy are going to be greater than the strong, the first will be last, et cetera, et cetera. You guys know these scriptures. And then we have this direct statement by Jesus in Matthew 25 that he somehow shows up in those who are sick, that when we visit the sick, we're visiting him. So we have a better account of why we care for the sick. We have a better account, I think, of the practitioner-patient relationship. The Christian story can train in us reverence toward this fellow human being who's made in God's image, whom we happen to have a chance to attend. We know that we're not treating a machine. We're not treating an abstraction. We're not treating a statistic. We're encountering Jesus himself in the flesh. It gives us a story in which we know, if we're formed by that story, if we're formed by the church, we know that we are not just accountable to the data, to evidence-based medicine, so-called. We're not just accountable to healthcare institutions and government institutions' quality measures. We're accountable to one another and to God. We know that it is a diminishment and a corruption of medicine to treat it as just a matter of arm's length transactions between customers and providers who wield their technical powers to satisfy patients' wishes or not. We know that instead it involves morally committed efforts, which is why we have a profession, but efforts to discern and act for the patient's good. And we know that acting for the patient's good, spending your life attending to those who are sick, seeking to preserve and restore their health, which is good for them, is good for us. That's how physicians and other medical practitioners flourish. Christian story makes sense of all that. It offers ample resources to resist the tendencies within contemporary medicine to treat patients like objects and to treat one another like mere providers of services. And I think Christianity gives us a better account of our obligations to the underserved. We have the tradition of the preferential option for the poor, as it's been called. We have blessed are the poor. It's right there in the Beatitudes. We have traditions that have developed, particularly moral tradition regarding the universal destination of the goods and the common good, which, in brief summary, is just the idea that all the goods of the earth have been created for everyone. Doesn't mean everybody has equal ownership and everything, and that we don't have private property. Clearly not. But it does mean that the point of these goods is that they be for the benefit of all, and that we are held accountable to whether the way we seek goods and distribute goods and share our goods and develop the goods that we've been given um, are done for the common good, that they're building up the community. And we're all joined as Christians, we know, into one body where weaker members deserve special honor. That's a story that I think can help enliven medicine. And we have a better account of the limits of medicine. We're taught to respect the givenness of our created natures. We know that it doesn't make sense to harm bodily health in pursuit of well-being of some ephemeral self that is somehow free of the body, because we know these bodies are created by God and are gifts. They're good, and they're honored by the incarnation and made that much more evidently good. We have a story that trains in us patience if we're being well trained by it. Trains us to practice gratitude, not just grasping at more health, more life. It teaches us not to try to escape the human condition, right? Not try to get out of life alive. We know that's a fool's errand. It teaches us not to turn our lives into anxiety about the future. Jesus in Matthew 6 says, "Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your span of life?" And St. Basil writes, Christians should not get so concerned about their health that they turn their lives into one long provision for the flesh. So those kinds of traditions and part of our story can help us not idolize health and idolize medicine, where we just spend all of our time worrying about whether we're healthy enough. Christianity gives, I think, a better check on the hubris of medicine, insofar as it teaches us that medicine's a gift, again, keeping us from making it an idol. It, I think, gives us resources for resisting the tendency that is really endemic in contemporary medicine to just medicalize all of human life willy-nilly. So just a final word here before we open up for conversation. I think that Christianity also can remind us, and this seems to be important in our time, where I actually don't know as much about how morale is among medical practitioners in Canada, but it's certainly poor in the US. And the Christian story reminds us of the goodness of practicing medicine. That the way of medicine, particularly when it's set in the Christian story, is a remarkable adventure. It's deeply meaningful in itself. It's a fitting way to spend your life. And I think one of the things that's been most encouraging to me about our theology, medicine, and culture initiative, as we have people study with us for a year or two, is that when they come to the end of that, very characteristically, we hear them say something to the effect of that this experience has helped them recover confidence that medicine, the practice of medicine, is good, that it's not just something to be managed, to balance the work against your life. It is good, and in a place where they can find their own fulfillment.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think if anybody has questions, please feel free to raise your hand or unmute. I might, start off with one question that came to mind during your talk. How do can you kind of trace back how patients' autonomy, like patient rights, kind of became so ascendant and really now the dominant kind of operating ethical principle that we seem to encounter in medicine, as you kind of described the provider services model?
Sure. So there's the short received narrative, and then there's a deeper story. But I'll tell you both of them briefly. The short story is that in the late 1960s, partly in response to a series of ethical scandals, particularly in the United States, the most infamous of which was the Tuskegee syphilis study, but it was not the only one. But there was a kind of public outcry against abuse of authority and privilege by healthcare professionals and medical researchers, and and a movement to check the power of people. And it's at that time you have emerged in a more systemic and now really ubiquitous and I think consensus way the principle of informed consent. It's probably been for the most part observed, but became really, and I think it remains the most important ethical principle in the practice of medicine is informed consent. Um, and so it's around that time then people started using the language too of paternalism as a almost an entirely negative sense, to act as paternalistically, which of course is just to act as a parent would, is something you should not do. Um, so then that a lot of people would refer to that as the patient's rights movement,
Hmm.
and that's late '60s to through middle '70s and into the latter part of the 1970s. But what happened pretty fast in this short story is that the pendulum swung from a putative paternalism, where doctors just give orders and tell people what to do, which seemed I think rightly to violate patient authority. It seemed to overestimate or misstate physicians' authority to tell people what to do.
Hmm.
It swung to the other end of the spectrum to what people came to call independent choice or patient sovereignty or unfettered autonomy, which very much fits the provider services model, where um, it's comes to seem that the good physician is one who asks the patient what they want, what their values are, what's important to them, what do they need for their well-being, what is your truth, and then
Hmm.
provides those services to them expertly. Um, and so that's the short story. And we've had since the late 1970s, when the book Beecham and Childress's Principles of Biomedical Ethics was published. I think it was actually published in '81. Um, although they put forward these four principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice, pretty quickly a lot of people started noticing that autonomy seemed to carry all the water because um, there was not a shared account of what the goods are that we're after. And so then that was deferred to the patient judgment, which means more autonomy. There was not a shared vision of what the harms are that we should have in view. Therefore, the harms become what the patient says are the harms. And there's not a vision, because you don't have a vision of the goods and the harms, you can't have a vision of justice. So that always gets deferred to the
Mm.
patient. So effectively, we pretty rapidly moved to this idea that ethical practice of medicine is to facilitate patient autonomy insofar as
Interesting.
possible. Now, no
Hmm.
one has ever
Mm.
fully practiced that way, except perhaps a few cosmetic plastic surgeons, um, because I think every doctor knows in her bones that when someone's sick, you're supposed to do what you can to try to make them well, preserve their health. And
Mm.
so when people roll into the ER docs don't ask them, "What do you want?" We say, "Hey, how can I help? What's going on?" So anyway, but that's the short story. The
Interesting.
longer story, which I won't make long, but is that actually this goes back, I think, hundreds of years to the whole project of modernity and the project of liberalism,
Mm.
which has been over generations, a steady effort to detach ourselves from external influences on our own autonomous sort of self-development. And so detach ourselves from traditions that we might have received, detach ourselves from expectations culturally, detach ourselves from any kind of external power. And we have this idea grow up of Carl Trueman in his recent book, some of you guys may have read or seen, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. We have this vision of the human as when they're most human, being fully free,
Mm.
unencumbered by other people, to basically choose the kind of life they want to live and to authentically develop as they see fit. And the effects of that have been in process again for hundreds of years. And so I think what we've experienced in the last two generations is like one prominent symptom of that deeper cultural movement. Um, yeah, and we have a chapter on this in the book if anyone wants to go into in more depth into it. It seems to me that autonomy, obviously, autonomy is important. Um, it seems pretty basic that it is, insofar as possible, better that people um, are able to choose or to act not under external coercive pressure, but according to their own lights regarding what they believe is good and true. That seems to be really essential to the possibility of integrity and to the idea of freedom that we've come to value so much in a society that's not to societies that are not, God willing, totalitarian. But we think within medicine, the first of all, the term autonomy was really most developed by Kant, Immanuel Kant, and he used the term entirely different from the way the term is used today. Kant meant by autonomy that one is a law unto oneself, as the word etymology suggests: auto, self, nomos, a law. And for Kant, you're only fully autonomous when you're acting only because you act only because of what the moral law requires you to do. Um, for Kant, any other reason why you might do something makes an action heteronymous. It makes it not autonomous. So effectively, what Kant meant by autonomous was you're autonomous when you do as you ought, when you act according to the moral law. That's obviously not the way the term is used today. The term instead has come to mean almost something directly contradictory to that, which is that autonomous means you're free to act without being encumbered by other people according to what you want, whether or not it's good, which again is not what Kant meant. We think the key idea behind autonomy is authority, and that is really important. It's certainly important that Christians respect authority. It's important that medical practitioners generally respect the limits of their own authority and respect the proper authority of the patient. And so, in a clinical encounter, the physician does have authority. What kind of authority do they have? We think they have the authority to make judgments about whether any particular medical proposal that they might make is a reasonable one, that it reaches a threshold of being a reasonable medical proposal. If it doesn't, then the physician has good reason not to offer it, or if it's requested of them, to refuse it. That's not a violation of patient autonomy. Rather, that's a proper exercise of physician authority, because so that's a physician authority. What the physician does not have authority to do is to demand that a patient do what the physician wants, which I think is why the principle of informed consent really is a crucially important principle in practice. It respects that the patient is the one who has authority to say whether or not they're going to cooperate with any medical proposal. And we think patients properly have that authority because patients are ones who have their own health in view, but they also have lots of other things in view. And it may not be for a given patient the right thing for them, all things considered, in their vocation, the right thing to pursue some aspect of health that the physician thinks they could pursue. So the patient has authority there to say, to either grant consent or withhold consent. That fits with this traditional understanding of medicine. The physician's already oriented toward patient health, and they make proposals of what they think reasonably will preserve, and restore health. The patient's in the position of having authority to grant or withhold consent to any of those proposals. Hope that makes sense. It's tough, and you're not alone. Uh, I think a couple of things here. One, as I suggested, I think it's really critical that we be able to remember our story. And I think part of that story is Christians have been, we've had a remarkable run here in the West for a few hundred years of remarkable amount of freedom to live according to Christian lights. But we have a lot longer history, including the history of Israel, where Christians have had to learn to get along in very broken, corrupt systems at significant disadvantage and at significant even threat sometimes. So I think, and yet find joy in pursuing the good that God has called you to pursue within that, whatever's possible. So I think that's a part of improving morale is remembering our story and why showing up one day at a time to not just to go along with the system, but to creatively practice with integrity within a broken system, within corrupted powers and principalities, without resentment, but with a kind of patience and joy, is a way of it's a way that God's working out in us our own sanctification, and is also preserving the world, in some measure, even if it doesn't look that way. The second thing is, I think it's really important that we practically have movements of associations of physicians that start to be visible more publicly as offering and modeling a different way of medicine, offering this ancient, still super compelling, simple, straightforward way of practicing medicine as a strictly healing practice. One of the things that I've been involved with for the past year is launching something we call the Hippocratic Society. And I'm going to be speaking about this at the Canadian Physicians for Life conference this weekend in Vancouver. But the Hippocratic Association is dedicated to forming clinicians in the practice and pursuit of good medicine. It's an association of physicians, of medical practitioners for the good practice of medicine, not of any third-party institutions, no one just trying to tell us what to do, but we're trying to practice meeting together in groups all across healthcare, starting with academic medical centers, and reasoning together about what medicine requires, reasoning together about how we grow in the virtues that are characteristic of good medicine, and how we fulfill our professions, and basically practicing nurturing a whole network that we hope will grow across the Western world of those who show forth in their practices and in their speech and in their visible associations a better way of medicine than just sending people off to the death chamber because they ask it.
I think, and I really appreciated Dr. Curlin, your, highlighting how sometimes patients are coming to you with questions that are strictly from this provider services model. They just want to know, how do I get the paperwork? How do I get my maid? This is what I want. And I just kind of have to remind myself to try to leave that door open for maybe some more questions that might come down the line, like what will this actually look like? How will my health continue to change? What resources are available for me when I need help in the home or things like that? And that, yes, I really appreciated your comments that Christians have in the practice of medicine these additional gifts of hospitality and, compassion and walking with people in their suffering that, may not be called on all the time, but when they are called upon, we can offer them.
I mean, it's why medicine is intrinsically good. I mean, you sit there and you experience that. It is good to listen, to be present, to using your skills and your abilities and what try to help people make sense of what they face and what choices they can make that are sensible. And, rather than just, I'm here to provide what here's all the possible things you can have, and, which ones do you want? Or as in the States, it's all basically driven by billing and this sort of creepy pseudo moralized idea of we have these hospital presidents telling us we really want to practice quality, but then all you basically get is what pressure to improve your efficiencies.
Going back to, the concept of physician wellness, it's exploded. In terms of the attention, in my division to physician wellness, mindfulness, retreats kind of focused around that. Um, and yeah, so, and I know other physicians in Alberta will kind of know what I'm talking about, the Well Doc Initiative and others, and probably that's going to be garnishing a lot of increased attention. I guess that yeah, I'm just kind of interested in your thoughts on you know this attempt to address physician burnout through initiatives which to me kind of seem to you know, involve a lot of self-help strategies, retreats and mindfulness and yoga and different types of offerings. I have to say they're quite diverse offerings, so I'm not trying to characterize generally, but how far do you think we'll get in the profession of medicine with that? And as Christians, yeah, how can we interact with that, benefit from that, contribute to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're going to get very far. I've thought about this a lot and given a few talks on this topic. Um, a lot of wellness is basically the system seeing that doctors are languishing, and that's not good. They're quitting. They're reducing the time they spend in patient care. I just was at a neighborhood meeting and met a doc who's been a hospitalist since I'd met her a few years ago, and then I found out now all she does is do billing for the hospital. She's just supervising billing reviews of doctors, and I can't tell you how many people, at least in the U.S. system, are in
Mhm.
that kind of a role. Um, the antidote, in my view, burnout can happen for lots of reasons. I don't think it's plausible that the main reason people are burning out is because they're working harder than they've worked in the past. Just watching how people worked in the past, I don't think that can be the answer. But it seems to me that the way that the system is mostly approaching burnout is as a problem of inadequate self-care or work-life balance. And so you have yoga and you have days off and you have ice cream and you have, sessions where you talk to each other. But if whenever we treat our work as if it's something that has to be balanced against life, we've already lost because then we're seeing work as a threat to life.
Mm.
If work goes up or work goes, more work, less life.
Mm.
That can't be a way to getting to better morale. Um, and self-care likewise treats work as if it's just a threat to you. Whereas it seems to me that the central challenge when doctors are burning out is to figure out why we're effectively not practicing medicine. I think it's just a symptom that the medicine we're practicing is sufficiently interrupted, corrupted, distracted, interfered with, and pushed in directions that aren't that worthwhile that we know down deep. And I'm not really practicing all that much medicine. I'm running around like crazy, but I'm not actually practicing medicine in a way that has integrity or that's good. And if we can return to practicing good medicine, which involves, of course, patience, as Amy was suggesting, and creativity and solidarity, and we're not going to be able to do it perfectly, and it requires trying to change policies over time, then that is its own reward. When doctors experience themselves really caring for the sick and the injured, seeking to preserve and restore their health, and not being interrupted in that by too many other things, their morale will be better, I think.
All right. I will also put in the chat here a link to your book, The Way of Medicine, which is
Thank you.
yeah, yeah. And does anybody else have any other thoughts or comments that they'd like to add here this evening?
I'm with you as another palliative medicine physician in the same commitment. And it's becoming increasingly, of course, among cosmopolitan uh, feeling settings, it's become increasingly expected that we treat medical aid in dying as one option that, of course, people should have. It's because everybody needs to die on their own terms and have their own autonomous decisions. And it may not be legal in your state, but you should at least offer what you can offer. Let's say offer voluntary, stopping of eating and drinking, et cetera. And I'm determined to consistently bring up with my colleagues locally and nationally. Well, no, uh, not if it's not reasonable to for a doctor to intentionally hasten someone's death, which it seems to me is the case, and as it seemed to people with an unbroken consensus for more than 2,000 years that was the case. Um, and so anyway, I'm just with you on that, and you put it really well, and I hope God will give you grace and you'll continue with that courage. I think if there were 100 doctors like you, Philip, Canada would probably change its laws. Now, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I think enough people standing up and just calmly, with charity and clarity, saying this will not do to ask us to basically contradict what we are as healers. I think you will find that the public doesn't really want to force people like you out of medicine.
Hmm.
I hope
Yeah,
that's true.
returning to that idea of like paternalism and everything. I'm not sure how to kind of frame this in a um, ethical way, but the concept of like the power differential when when a physician who's looking after you is suggesting a medical treatment, then there's a implicit kind of suggestion that this is good for you or recommended, and you just have no idea where that patient is coming from, what their stance is on their own view of life and um, health and disability, and so it can introduce a definite pressure like from a physician. Um, so I don't know if we can kind of like work those concepts of paternalism and so on into this discussion of like how MAID is presented to patients, but it certainly strikes me that like in the case of a woman who's going for surgery and going under the knife and under the care of a physician, that same person is offering MAID. There's a pretty strong kind of um,
Suggestion.
yeah, suggestion there from that person who's looking after them that they should be thinking about this, right? Um,
Right.
anyway, yeah. Um, but how that looks
No,
in a
yeah.
society where we have, already kind of walked away from that paternalistic, kind of attitude in medicine and kind of said that we put patient autonomy first.
It seems to me that it's quite striking that whereas in Canada, what was legalized was both. That, as you say, 99% of people who die by May die by euthanasia in Canada. I think it shows a couple of things. One, the way that euthanasia hides the fact that this is suicide. It gives the pretense of it being a medical intervention rather than a form of suicide, assisted suicide. Whereas when you have to take the pills yourself, I think it's more people experience this. I'm actually dying by my own hand, and there's a strong God given, I think, but clearly strong human resistance to doing that to oneself. But once it's just like going into surgery. You go into the pre-op if anybody's been in surgery, and from there you're just kind of helpless. You're just carried along, and and um, and you trust that the doctors are doing what good people do because that's what medicine is good. So I think it's quite disturbing the way that it's euthanasia that people opt for, and the way that it gives to me this this patina of this being a medical intervention. when it's just a form of killing. One of the arguments I make with colleagues is, look, if we think people have a right to die on their own terms by suicide or by having someone killed at mercy killing, why not at least keep doctors out of it for the sake of clarity and trust with people who don't want that and are worried about it? And we could train funeral directors, give them a little machine, super simple technologically to kill a human being, sadly. We could do that, but of course nobody wants to do that because that'll actually look like we're just killing people rather than practicing compassionate medicine. I do think the encouraging thing is, when you hear Philip talk, it's just crystal clear that this is a corruption of medicine. And one day people are going to wake up and see it again. And they're going to be looking at the bodies and going, what did we do? But they will wake up and see it again because the corruption is going to it's going to make the practice of medicine more and more at odds with what people know down deep they need from a healer. But it could be a while, sadly.
So in other ways, kind of restoring physicians, any other kind of tips for Christian practices that can help physicians be centered and kind of focused on their calling in medicine?
Well, the same guy, Alan Verhey, used to talk about the mundane practices of Christian faithfulness. I mean, going to church, praying, confessing our sins, meeting with other Christians to encourage one another. But I think practically within medicine, meeting with others around, not just around, okay, we happen to both be doctors and we're Christians, so we're going to go have a Bible study and not talk about medicine, just talk about the Bible. But no, meeting together to think, how can we fulfill this profession in this world that we inhabit today, with the challenges we face today, is really important, I think. There's so much atomization among medical practitioners where everybody's off on their own. We're on our computers. We don't go to the lounge anymore. We hardly talk to each other. We don't write letters to each other anymore in the way we used to. There's a kind of loneliness and a sense that we're helpless because it's all run by a big systematic. There's all these systems in place, and the individual physician feels pretty helpless to change much. That's where I think starting to meet, as Christians did in the ancient world when they were forming churches, meet together, break bread together, think about how to live with integrity, practice with integrity, with joy in your work, and trust that these over time you can, the God will take care of you, and that you can join with others, and the movement can grow.
Mm-hmm. I would like to just offer a verse and a bit of a prayer. Um, Dr. Curlin mentioned you're heading to Vancouver for the Canadian Physicians for Life conference this weekend. I know several other people may be involved with that as well, but we'll pray that goes well too, as physicians here in Canada again have a chance to meet together. I was thinking about Hebrews 10, verse 23. Let us hold to the confession of our hope without wavering, since he who promised is faithful. And so thanks to all who were able to come and join today and participate, and most especially thanks to Dr. Curlin all the way from North Carolina.